just to let, got it. And so the reason we record these events again is we hope that our colleagues can use this in their classes, offer it as extra credit, and all you would have to do is go to our social justice website, which we'll put in the chat. My name is Sangha Niyogi. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I teach sociology, and I co-direct the social justice program with Dr. Albert Ponce. As the number of Ukrainians arriving at the US-Mexico border began to tick up, the US Department of Homeland Security issued a special memo advising border officials that they could, on a case-by-case basis, offer that particular group special treatment. Unlike tens of thousands of other migrants fleeing violence in other countries, border guards could exempt Ukrainians from the public health order, Title 42. This heightened sense of responsibility, while commendable, is noticeably different than what Americans usually do when there's a conflict where you have millions of refugees from non-white and non-Christian countries. Per an agreement with the Mexican government, Guatemalans, Hondurans, El Salvadoran migrants can be expelled back to Mexico. Between September 19th and March 17th, the US has returned more than 18,800 Haitians back to a country riven with gang violence, political instability, economic collapse, and fallout from natural disasters. The way Ukrainians have been received at the border raises a moral conundrum. I think that these are important questions that all of us as Americans have to ask ourselves. Where are the limits of our sense of humanitarianism? Do those limits have racial boundaries and religious ones? And if so, what does that say about us as a country? Well, as you know, we always like to tackle these uncomfortable topics. We believe that social justice education has the potential to empower communities, resist and disrupt oppressive power structures, and work for solidarity. Our goal is for students to develop and deepen their understanding of who they are by supporting them in broadening their horizons, building passions, and finding their purpose. The social justice program is transferable to CSUs and UCs. We are interdisciplinary, and to begin our program, we offer 3 sections of the core course, Introduction to Social Justice, in 3 different modalities. Online asynchronous with Professors Mickey Huff and Albert Ponce. Online with a synchronous element with myself and Dr. Ponce. And Professor Frank Ortega teaches an in-person section at our local Alhambra Senior High School in Martinez. We also have community engagement at the heart of our program, for which we are very proud to say we have our community advisory board with community partners such as Monument Impact, Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance, Safe Returns Richmond, and the Rainbow Community Center. And these community partners have helped us design an advancing tiers model of community engagement. If you have any questions at all about the program, please feel free to email me or Dr. Ponce. So without further ado, I now ask my comrade, Dr. Albert Ponce, to do the honor of introducing our esteemed speaker.
Thank you, Sandra. This is it's a great honor to build from the foundation that not only that Dr. Niyogi introduced here to think about people in movement for survival around the globe, but also in the foundation that we've established in this program here at Diablo Valley College, which we're really proud of, that extends into our communities and our communities and the commitments that folks on the ground are committed to changing and altering and building a better society. So today's guest speaks true to this. So, and as we think of, before I introduce Professor Justin Akers Chacón, I want us to think about this world that we exist in with vast inequalities, where billionaires continue to accumulate vast amounts of wealth extracted from the labor of the global workforce. Specifically, what Justin Akers Chacón's work unveils is how that class warfare is managed by the racial rulers of capital, where capital investments and corporations are free to move all across the globe, but yet we're humans who are in that struggle for survival, who seek to move to those places where they can make a living or become targets for state-sanctioned racial violence. And this is the way in which labor and the extraction of the value that emerges from it, or what we see as profit for those corporations, begins to emerge and is managed globally. Our focus today is on Professor Justin Akers' work at the border, at the South. So I'm very honored and been engaging his work from his first book that I read back in 2006, that he co-wrote with Mike Davis, No One is Illegal, to us specifically. Organizing this book spoke volumes to how to really challenge this type of racial violence. Justin Akers Chacón is an educator, he's an activist, he's a writer in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. He is professor of Chicano and Chicano Studies at San Diego City College. His recent works include No One is Illegal, that I just mentioned, Fighting Racism and State Violence on the US-Mexico border with Mike Davis, Haymarket Books. And in 2018, he wrote Radicals in the Barrio, Magonistas, Socialists, Wobblies, and Communists in the Mexican-American Working Class. And his most recent work, The Border Crossed Us, The Case for Opening the US-Mexico Border, 2021, will inform what we're about to hear today. So let's all unmute and welcome our guest speaker, Professor Justin Akers Chacón. Floor is yours. And then we'll open up to Q&A after.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nyogi and Profe Ponce and Diablo Valley College for having me here. And let me just say that I've been speaking a lot for many years now, and I'm more nervous now speaking here than I am in my other experiences because I'm speaking to a community of community college people, which I am a community college graduate and a community college teacher, and I'm very proud and committed to the community college system. So yeah, forgive me if I wobble a little bit because I'm honored to be here and speaking in front of you today. So yeah, I am a first generation community college student, graduate, etc. Descendant of Mexican immigrants, Mexican migrants who came a long time ago. So my family came originally from Michoacan, Mexico, in the early 1900s during the period of the Mexican Revolution, and settled in Ventura County. So my roots are in Ventura County, north of Los Angeles. But I've been living here in San Diego County, Kumeyaay land, since the early 90s, and I live actually in the south of the county, Chula Vista, which is right up near, very near to the border with Tijuana. And so I've been living here since the early 90s. And before I became a community college graduate and then ultimately community college professor, I was an activist. I was a worker who, worked minimum wage jobs, but I was drawn and politicized by what I experienced here on the border, what I saw, and ultimately devoted, ever since I was, since I moved here in the early 90s, I've been an activist for immigrant rights, justice, border demilitarization, etc. So yeah, so my worldview comes first as an activist, then and then I try to frame my academics through that lens, which is trying to write and trying to develop theory, trying to develop analysis that can aid in the struggle, not so much just to entertain academic discourse, but to hopefully be a tool. And I'm currently part of a border abolition collective here that is trying to shut down a detention center. So in California, we still have several privately run for-profit detention centers. One of the larger ones is here in San Diego County, not too far from where I live, and it's run as a for-profit institution by a company called CoreCivic. Okay, so when my ancestors crossed the border in 1913, it looked nothing like it does today. In fact, what I want to try to paint here is a picture of what's happened specifically over the last 40 years and how, how the border, how immigration enforcement has turned into a juggernaut of state violence and repression. But I also want to explain why I think that process has developed and become so normalized. And so I want to touch on a number of points that I make in the book, The Border Crossed Us. And then I also look forward to having discussion. So please feel free to weigh in with questions, comments, etc. So let me start by saying where we're at today. So great introduction, talking about the contradictions of who gets to come into the United States as refugees, who doesn't. So right now, April 18, 2022, the border region is one that can best be characterized as a war zone, not a war zone between two warring parties, but a war zone between the infrastructure of immigration, repression, and a large population of people who have been trying to get into the United States as refugees over the last few years. I won't talk too much about how Trumpism and how the role that Trump played. I want to focus the first part of my talk talking more about what's happening now under Biden, because I want to make it clear that my critique of the political system is not so much a partisan critique towards the Democratic Party or towards the Republican Party, but towards a political system that has developed largely in unison in the direction towards the repression of migrants, not so much as repression of migrants solely for the purpose of trying to stop migration, because I don't think that's ever really been the point of immigration enforcement, but rather to cultivate, create, and segregate a population of people, many of whom are workers, so that their labor can be super exploited. And I'll talk more about what I mean by super exploitation. But Trump is notorious, right, for the things that led him to win political office in 2016. Using very openly racist and reactionary discourse to try to cultivate and build a base amongst people in the society that we can link back to a long history of white nationalism and white supremacy. I would say that was the core of the population that he was talking to, and we see how that core has been activated ever since. But under his administration, he passed roughly 400 executive orders, all of which were to further imperil the lives of refugees, migrants, and undocumented people. Since transitioning to the Democrats in 2020, a slight Democratic majority, and then the Biden-Kamala Harris administration, much of that infrastructure has been maintained. In fact, only very superficial aspects of what Trump built up through executive order has been dismantled or modified. And so what we've seen in the last almost 2 years is really the institutionalization of Trumpism, because of the way that when things happen under one party, they can either be rolled back or they can be institutionalized under the next. And I would argue that there's never been the rolling back of immigration enforcement. It's only moved towards institutionalization, even though, if you remember, the Biden administration promised to roll back Trump era executive orders, and promised to introduce an immigration reform as one of his first acts. And here we are a year and a half later, and we've seen things go in the opposite direction. It's unfortunate, but I'm not surprised. And so I'll try to explain why. So, so let me say a few more things about where we're at today. So there's perhaps 20 to 25,000 people on the US-Mexican border on the Mexican side in a state of limbo, because from Trump to Biden, the last real path towards a legal process of entering into the United States, which was through the asylum seeking process, has been effectively ended. Kamala Harris, on one of the first acts for the vice president under the Biden administration in 2020, early 2021, was to go, 2021, was to go to Guatemala and make a public declaration on behalf of the Biden administration that refugees should no longer go to the United States. Her words were, "Do not come, don't come." And that's exactly what Trump said. And so, so there might be different methods, but essentially we've seen the institutionalization of the closing of, again, the last path towards legit, from the state's point of view, legitimate entry into the United States as refugees through the asylum seeking process. So a few more things. Yeah, so we have a large population of people in limbo. We have detention centers that are filling up again. We have growing populations of economically displaced people in motion again, especially from central and southern Mexico. And we have the continuity now of an enforcement-only approach. So remain in Mexico, Title 42, mass deportation, and the intensification of the factors of displacement are all happening now as they at a level that perhaps is even more extreme than they have been previously. So why is it that the U.S. state can only repress migrants? Because if we try to find the good guy, bad guy narrative, and then we run into a problem because of what I just laid out, which is a continuity. And I would argue a continuity going back to the early 90s. But I want to shift gears here and try to talk about some of the origins of this continuity. And I want to locate it first in an understanding of the United States foreign policy. But I'm going to use a term perhaps more direct, which is I'm going to use the term imperialism. And imperialism, I'm going to not go into too much in terms of like trying to explain this as a concept historically or academically, but to say that in this particular case, to see how the United States has historically seen Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean as an extension of its own terrain, of its own territory, especially for economic and political purposes. And so when we understand in capitalism, operating across borders in a way that benefits those in the nation in which the capitalists are moving their money across borders, imperialism, I would argue, is the mechanism by which capitalism can operate on a transnational or international scale. And so if we look at the system of capitalism, especially in the US, and I'm going to be focusing most of my attention on the US, as a system, it needs to expand. It needs to grow, right? It needs to constantly seek out new sources of profit. That is the core internal mechanism of capitalism. So accumulation for profit, and then the reinvestment of capital to acquire more profit. From the US standpoint, as I mentioned, Mexico, the Caribbean nations, Central America especially, have been seen and treated as an extension of the US economy for purposes of capitalist investment. Most recent, in the last few decades, we've seen a radical transformation of Mexico. When I first moved here in the 1990s, I liked to go to Tijuana because I like Tijuana. Tijuana is one of the greatest cities in the world. If you've never been there, visit it. It's an amazing place. But I used to like to go. I was 19 when I first moved to San Diego, and I used to spend a lot of time there. And it's a whole different world now, right? So just in the short period of time that I've been alive and living in this region, I've seen much of the Tijuana economy transformed. And when I mean transformed is that it now in many in many ways is an extension of San Diego. It's U.S. capital controls much of the infrastructure. You know, you can't go go too far without there being a Walmart or an Amazon. They just built an Amazon fulfillment center right across the border in Tijuana, and much of the economy nationwide is actually U.S. owned, even though they operate under often under Mexican or names or Spanish language names. And the same thing has happened in Central America. And in my book, I talk about this. I talk about how much of these economies have been remade, and how they're now essentially sources of great profit for U.S. investors. And I talk about how wealth has been transferred. So when capital goes in and profit is made, it's repatriated. It tends to leave the country, and so we've seen this happening over a period of time in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America. And I'll talk more about the mechanisms in a minute. But I do want to also say that this process is not a new process, but it's a new version of a historical process that we could identify in colonialism, where the long history of the United States and Mexico has been one where there has been a constant effort to extract, to invest and extract wealth. And in fact, the Mexican Revolution itself was a reaction to this, right? It was a reaction to a period of time in which Mexicans lost control of their economy, and the most poor and oppressed and the working class rose up against those conditions of displacement, et cetera. But we see that in the most recent phase of history, the mechanism for what I would refer to as economic neocolonization, and ultimately that being the main factor that leads to the displacement of peoples and migration, has been facilitated through free trade agreements. And so free trade agreements, these sound like they should be good, right? I mean, whenever we use free, oftentimes it's in a good context, freedom, but it's not really about free trade agreements, or free trade between equals, or something that bestows upon people more freedom. What they actually are. So I'm talking specifically about, for instance, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, now called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Even before that, Haiti was mentioned. Haiti was governed under another free trade agreement in the 1980s called the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And what these essentially are kind of like, we have to look at the context in which these have been implemented. They're kind of like battering rams, used by the United States to force open economies that have historically been colonized and have tried to develop mechanisms for preventing recolonization. And in Mexico, this meant a very protected economy that basically restricted the way in which capital could come in and colonize, right? So I talk about that in the new book. I won't go too much into that, except to say that that model was displaced in the 1980s because of debt. Because if you're in a rich nation and you have a lot of money, and you on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're in a what's considered a developing or really a formerly colonized nation that had already been robbed in previous historical epochs, and you're trying to build up an economy. If you're operating in the same economy, that inequality ultimately creates imbalances. And an imbalance that occurred in Mexico and in other countries in the region in the 1970s and 80s led to debt. And through debt, through US banks essentially operating through the US state, along with their partners internationally, they required that Mexico get rid of all of its protective measures and allow for the free operation of US capital eventually with no restrictions. So today, as a result of that, Mexico is the most economy in the world. It has the least amount of restrictions for foreign capital. It actually has so many free trade agreements with internationally that allows international capital to operate virtually without restriction. It's the most free traded nation in the world. It has more free trade agreements than both the United States and China combined. And it's not a coincidence that over the course of the implementation of these free trade agreements, we see mass displacement. So for instance, today in the United States, there's at least 1.5 million Haitians who have left Haiti since the implementation of the Caribbean Basin Initiative. There's been 7 million people that left Mexico for the United States between 1994, the implementation of NAFTA, and 2008, the economic recession. And there's been at least 3 million Central Americans that have left that region since 2010. So when we think of the images, the discourse of people coming to the border as refugees, these people are economically displaced. There are other factors that contribute to their displacement, and I would locate those also in US policies. I would situate those also in a kind of imperialist architecture that's been developed over this period of time. But it's important to recognize that the push factors, if we want to use this term, have originated in Washington, D.C. Because when people invest in a region like Mexico, so for instance, Walmart has become the largest retailer in Mexico. It's also now the largest retailer in the Northern Triangle of the Caribbean. When when capital is invested, there's an expectation for a return on investment in the form of profit. But the existence of this company has a displacing effect, multiplier effects when it operates in a place like Mexico. It leads to the demolition really of other industries, especially because Walmart operates on such a scale internationally that they can move goods from Asia, move them to US, move them to Mexican markets, and so their business model is to basically keep wages as low as possible and export their profits out of Mexico without having to really invest in the communities, and the jobs that they provide that are supposed to scoop up all the displaced people end up being also very low wage jobs that can't absorb the amount of people that are actually displaced through these multiplier effects. I mean, I could go on, but basically this has been happening across the region now for a few decades. And so, so this is at least a way of starting to understand, aside from the discourse that we use in this country, to why people migrate. So we see a mass movement of peoples from this region into the United States as migrants. Yet we don't see a change in our immigration policy in the direction of incorporation, right? We don't see a legalization. We see instead a trajectory towards more and more criminalization. So, for example, in 1994, the same year that NAFTA, this opening up of Mexico to U.S. capital, U.S. investors, et cetera, the same year of the implementation, January 1st, 1994, was the same year that Operation Gatekeeper went into effect, a federal policy to begin building a border wall, a sort of military-style wall in San Diego, Tijuana, and then ultimately across to Texas and Chihuahua. And so this patchwork of military wall becomes the foundation for controlling displacement, or at least, coinciding with displacement. And from there, we see a long arc towards more and more building up of the immigrant or migrant refugee repressive apparatus. So I'll give you a few more examples. In 1996, and by the way, in 1994, there was a Democratic administration in power. It was the Bush, excuse me, I get them confused. It was the Clinton Gore administration. And I know because I remember campaigning, doing my part to try to get people to vote. It was the period of my first politicization, not because of NAFTA or the border wall. I wasn't cognizant of that yet, but because way back then, the Clinton administration campaigned on universal health care. And I thought, hey, I could use that. It didn't work out either. That's another story. 1996, immigrants, legally authorized immigrants, to use the language of the state, and undocumented immigrants who are already largely excluded, generally are going to be removed from accessing most public resources. So we're going to begin to see the sort of repression of migrants and refugees and immigrants at the point of having access to social services. That also was the same year that the deportation machine was largely going to be constructed in the way that we understand it today, through a federal policy passed under, passed with bipartisan support. We also see that same year the beginnings of the process of empowering the police to work with federal agencies to begin to engage in immigration enforcement. And then 2001 to 2003, after 9/11, we see a whole new apparatus of repressions going to be created, starting with the targeting of Arabs and Muslims, Persian, Middle Eastern, African peoples through the quote unquote war on terror. And that's where we see the development of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, is going to be created, right? So when I get to abolition in a minute, we talk about something being created. If something's created, it can be gotten rid of, right? Especially in our lifetimes, because one of the tendencies working against the concept of abolition is the way the repressive agencies and apparatuses of the state seem eternal, right? But they're not. And much of the immigration enforcement apparatus has been just created in the last few decades. So we see after 9/11, 2001, the transition from the drug war. That was the official justification for militarization of the border and regulating, regulating cross-border movements, to, more or less a war on undocumented people, starting with the rounding up of undocumented Arabs and Muslims, like I mentioned, African, Middle Eastern peoples, and then a process of forcing people to be registered if they come from nations associated with these populations. And ICE was at the forefront of that. ICE was the agency that essentially was charged with repressing those sections of the population. But then after 2003, and especially by 2006, we see that ICE operates almost exclusively on rounding up undocumented people from Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, et cetera. And over this period of time, since 2003, we've seen the development of the Department of Homeland Security as the most funded armed agency of the state. I mean, the DHS as a whole. It embodies the Border Patrol. The two largest sectors are the Border Patrol and ICE. And its personnel and its funding have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. It just never stops, right? The DHS budget is $54 billion in 2022, and it'll probably go up in 2023. It's only been increasing. So not only did it continue to rise from Trump under Trump, but it's risen under Biden as well. We've seen the expansion of, at its high point, thousands of detention centers across the country. We've seen not only that, but the privatization of much of the immigration detention system. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we've seen the expansion of police incorporation into immigration enforcement, the expansion of surveillance, monitoring, workplace databases, and verification systems. And we've seen the expansion at the state level with just hundreds of laws that are designed to enforce a very an extreme right-wing idea that has become normalized in the society. It was begun by white supremacists, white nationalists associated with a think tank called the Center for Immigration Studies, which is called enforcement through attrition, which is you make life so difficult for undocumented people that they will self-deport. By 2012, Mitt Romney ran his campaign on this idea. He used the word self-deport. This was begun by an avowed white supremacist, white nationalist think tank, popularized by right-wing Republican politicians and ultimately embodied and institutionalized by Democrats as well. Okay, so I'm going to, oh yeah, and just to not to leave out some other important parts. Since 1996, there's been an average of 750,000 to 1 million people deported each year. So the institutionalization of the deportation machine has continued. And so under Biden, for instance, despite him promising a moratorium on deportation to review whether there's problems with our immigration enforcement system, we've actually seen 1.6 million people deported since Biden came to power, including the brutal and tragic deportation of Haitian refugees, who otherwise would have been able to come through, had not the Remain in Mexico policy been established and then enforced under Biden, because they were following a path towards asylum seeking that for many decades was a legal and authorized and considered safe method for people to come into the country, to seek asylum. Okay, and looking at time here. So let me start with a question: why not just legalize people, and then shift to try to answer that question. I argue in the book that legalization has been closed as an option going back to the early 2000s. In 1986, the last major comprehensive policy towards immigration that actually included a progressive or inclusive clause, right? So in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act contained something called amnesty, which basically was a direct path towards legalization without having to jump through extreme legal hurdles, pay exorbitant fines or fees, etc., but a direct path towards legalization. That amnesty was passed as part of a larger comprehensive package that included the first significant funding for immigration enforcement, the beast that I just talked about, this massive machine that's been constructed. Well, what happened with amnesty was that between 1986 and 1992, about 3 million people were able to become citizens. And for various reasons, the labor movement in this country, organized labor, which had a very mixed record on supporting immigrants, some labor unions had already begun to shift towards a recognition that undocumented workers were actually at the forefront of organizing themselves and organizing unions going back to the 1970s, and recognize that, hey, if we can help get these people their status regularized, then we can better organize them into our unions. While other unions were saying the opposite. No, we got to enforce our borders. We got to deport people who are undocumented, or they're taking our jobs. So there's been divisions in the labor movement, but for that period of time, there was a shift, and these 3 million people who were legalized, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them entered into the labor unions. Not only did they enter into labor unions, but they became advocates and organizers through their labor unions, who then began to try to push the unions to support policies that benefited their whole communities. There's been a large number of studies that were financed in the years after this, both by people who wanted to show, like organized labor, that this was beneficial, and by right-wing and conservative and academic think tanks that wanted to find the flaws. They wanted to show how this wasn't good for the economy or for the US. And I've compiled all these studies in my research, and they all, for the most part, point to one thing, which is wages went up, not only for undocumented workers, unionization went up for immigrant workers who were legalized, but also wages went up for all workers, because the lowest threshold that was artificially created for wages and working conditions was lifted. And so the tendency is that wages go up when the lowest wages rise, right? And as I document in the book, in the current book, that wasn't lost on the capitalists in this country. That wasn't lost on the people who had in part built their fortunes off being able to profit off of cheap exploitable labor that was undocumented. And so there was a lot of discussion by the late 1990s and early 2000s that I document in the book between political actors, at the highest levels, where they basically consensed that it's no longer viable for our economy to legalize immigrants. And since then is when I coincide with this building of the repressive apparatus and the declining of wages for undocumented people and the declining of wages for everybody else, the general trends. In fact, there was a great study done that I document that shows that the wages for US born workers who have citizenship and undocumented workers tend to be in parity in the same industries up until the 1980s when criminalization starts. And then after the 1990s, they diverge, but they both diverge in a downward arc. So there's something to be said here about the way in which the repression and the denial of access to citizenship of workers who are undocumented, keeping workers undocumented and over longer periods of time coincides with the growth, with the accumulation of wealth and widening social inequality. And in fact, that's the thesis of my book, is that capitalism now depends on the super exploitation, has depended on for some time, but now it's institutionalized, that maintaining a large population of undocumented workers under conditions of repression, under conditions of artificially suppressed wages and working conditions, is now actually a function of how capitalism operates. So I'm gonna move to conclusion here. I know I'm running on time here. So as I mentioned, after the late 1990s, it already was repressive, but any talk towards legalization largely ended. Because of that, by 2006, by 2005, I should say, there was really the beginning of an onslaught of legal of proposed laws that would have begun criminalizing workers, undocumented workers, on a nationwide level. So there was an attempt to create a comprehensive immigration policy in 2005. It was called the Sensenbrenner-King Bill. And this would have made it a felony to be undocumented in the United States, right? And that bill led to one of the largest outpourings of opposition, and as I argue in my first book, the largest expression of worker militancy in this country in the 21st century, which were the May Day protests of 2006, where 3 million people marched, went on strike, and boycotted to oppose what was called the Sensenbrenner-King Bill, and ultimately killed it. Right, killed it because it became politically impossible to pass under conditions of such opposition, and that movement pushed an electoral change. In 2006, the November elections, the Democrats won the House of Representatives. It was a full Republican control prior to that. In 2008, they won control of the government, of the federal government, the executive, the presidency, Obama. They won a majority in the Senate. They won a majority in the House. They actually had a super majority. And they Obama campaigned on, si se puede, immigration reform in the first 100 days. Well, we know that didn't happen. But I just want to point out that if they wanted to, they could have passed an amnesty without one single Republican vote, and they didn't. And again, I explain in the book why, but I'll emphasize here that there was shifts in how capitalism was restructuring, and the idea of legalizing more immigrants or legalizing more undocumented people was no longer a factor, especially as it becomes more and more a way for capital to make money. And not only that, but across the border as well through the free trade agreement. So keeping the border means keeping workers contained on one side of the border and divided from workers on the other. And the status then means that workers can be exploited on both sides of the border through free trade agreements, et cetera. There were electoral promises again in 2012. There were electoral promises again under Biden to pass legalization. So this period I characterize as the end of reform, that there's no longer an electoral pathway, towards legalization because of the closing strictures of the way the capitalist class is willing to, the unwillingness essentially to go through another amnesty and disrupt the methods of capital accumulation. So I'll just finish by saying a couple things. When I talk about the way capital has been wired, I want to point out that there's an unintended consequence of the extension of the U.S. economy into Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And that unintended consequence is that workers are now essentially organized into kind of like assembly lines across industries, sometimes working for the same company, sometimes producing the same product. And it's created a new phenomenon of what I call the transnationalization of the North American working class. So, for instance, where I live, right across the border in Tijuana, stretching all the way to Tamaulipas, there's thousands of manufacturing facilities, assembly and production facilities that are U.S. owned. And they make products for for U.S. Then they make either components for U.S. products, but they also are making cars. They're basically functioning as industrial workers. But the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico under the free trade agreements and under the guiding policies of these production facilities are called maquiladoras, is that there's an agreement to keep them union free, to keep them wages as low as possible, and the value added by the labor then makes enormous profits for when the end product is sold. And it's interesting because so much of this economy has been established. Sometimes this is referred to as supply chain production, right? So we talk about disrupted supply chains because of the pandemic and the war the war in Ukraine. But really what supply chain production is moving aspects of production to where you could find lower wages. And the border, is the deciding factor that determines that wages are much lower in Mexico, along with the agreements that are based on keeping the labor markets as suppressed as possible and keeping it, Mexico as attractive to foreign capital as possible. This is the kind of way that it's talked about. But in those maquiladoras, there's been an outbreak of unionization. There's been strikes along the border in the last 2.5 years. In 2019, there was wildcat strikes in over 45 of these maquiladoras that produce car parts for GM, for Ford, for Nissan, for Volkswagen, right? Actually, Mexico is like the 4th largest producer of cars in the world now, but it's not producing Mexican cars. It's international capital using Mexican workers to produce their cars and then sell them in the US or sell them back in Europe or wherever, mostly in the US because of the proximity to the markets. And unionization has spread through the auto industry. The workers at GM just formed their first independent union after kicking out the phony union that worked with the bosses to keep automotive wages as low as possible. I could go on about this. In agriculture, the largest strike in North American history happened in 2015 in Baja California. 25,000 workers shut down a multinational corporation called Driscoll's Berries, which is the largest international producer of berries. They shut down production in a general strike across the peninsula. I mean, we don't tend to hear about these things too much unless we're paying attention, but it had a big impact. It led to the formation of a new union there. And in the book, I cover several different industries where we see workers on both sides of the border disrupting the supply chains through strikes and unionization. And we've seen the first stages where workers on both sides of the border have been collaborating. And this is what I argue is a pathway towards abolition of the border enforcement regime, is cross-border class struggle, cross-border unionization, the elaboration of demands for equal pay for equal work across the border. And if you look at what recently happened at Amazon, Amazon in Staten Island organized the first union, it was mainly African-American, African, and Latino workers. I'm guessing, I don't know offhand, but I'm guessing many of them don't have, maybe have work visas or not work visas, but, maybe don't have citizenship. Maybe they have green cards or et cetera. Because here in San Diego, we have a binational Amazon complex that was just built. And the workers on the US side are mostly Mexicans who cross the border. And the workers on the Mexican side, of course, are Mexican workers in Mexico. And the workers there are in the early stages of organizing, but they're thinking about trying to organize on both sides of the border at the same time. And in both of those Amazon complexes, they're only 2 miles apart. And the reason they're 2 miles apart is because they're on each side of the border. The workers in Tijuana get paid $1 an hour. The workers in Southeast San Diego doing the same work get paid $16 an hour. So that border ensures that on the one side, wages are as low as possible. And if wages are as low as possible on that side, then it ensures that wages are as low as possible on this side. So I'll just conclude by saying that, like, the failure of reform shows the danger embedded in anti-immigration politics. We've seen the rise of, well, Trump catalyzed a neo-white supremacist, white nationalist movement. We've seen the rise of the far right internationally using anti-immigration politics as their entry point into the mainstream. For instance, right now in France, a neo-fascist political party that has campaigned primarily on blocking immigration from Africa and the Middle East, is poised to potentially win. And we've seen these breakthroughs all across the world, unfortunately, through anti-immigration and the racist politics, attached to that. And we see that this is probably going to be the defining issue of the congressional elections in November 2022. If you look at what the Republicans are actually doing and saying, they're talking about, and they're making immigration enforcement again their main issue, and they're probably going to win. But on the other hand, we have the experience of the Black Lives Matter rebellion of 2020 that showed how large numbers of people have mobilized against racism and the repressive apparatus of the state. And we've seen how that has transitioned into the immigrant rights movement, which is much smaller now, but nevertheless still organizing, which is embedding this idea of defunding ICE, defunding the border military apparatus, but also not having illusions that we're gonna be able to accomplish that without struggle, both in the form of supporting the class struggles that are happening transnationally, the struggles that are happening in the sending nations. I didn't mention that there's been major movements in places like Honduras and Haiti in the last few years, opposing the policies of free trade and trying to basically resist those policies at the point of where they're being implemented. Same in south of Mexico. So there's a lot of factors where we can look to see where our power lies to actually compel the change that could produce abolition. But unless we understand how the political system in this country is heavily wired into the way capitalism operates, and why it's not likely going to budge on the question of legalization and lead to more and more of a right wing of a sort of increase in the sort of barbarism of immigration enforcement, unless we understand those, we're going to be limited to what we can do. And so the movement has to move in that direction towards organizing for abolition, organizing for cross-border solidarity, and organizing for international solidarity with the peoples of the whole peoples of the region who are in many ways showing us how we can abolish the immigration enforcement regime that is oppressing so many of us collectively.
All right. So thank you, Professor. This was a lot to really take in and to think about the way that capital functions in controlling and extracting value from workers when they're not even in the territory of the United States. Because this is a way that we conceive of migrants coming here and then being exploited, saying people in industries in the United States. But I think one thing you pointed to and illustrated is how those workers do not even need to be in the United States itself to be able to maximize the value of US corporations. They are producing the goods wherever they're at, and Wall Street controlling sort of and manipulating the wages for those workers. So this was a deep analysis of how these forms of global capitalism in this stage are operating. And I think it's provoking a lot of questions. And I think, Professor Nyogi, should we open it up for questions now? And I see Don had a couple questions. Don, do you want to unmute on your, are you still with us, or we can?
Okay, hi. It's such a incredibly layered issue. And I think, Justin, what I really appreciated that you kind of brought to the fore is how workers actually almost now, regardless of where they are geographically, are still being, well, I guess minimized, and minimized for pay, but maximized for work. And how do we begin to address this when, you have one administration that might be implementing it, but then you have another administration coming in that just kind of quietly keeps these policies on the books? And I mean, how do we begin to approach this?
Go ahead and.
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. For me, the way I would answer that would be to point out, try to understand and point out how economics shapes politics and not the other way around, in the U.S. context, where specifically looking at the two political parties, if we're focusing on why we can't get different, why we can't actually see a differentiation ultimately in the trajectory of how they govern on these issues. So we have to have an analysis of how capitalism operates. We have to have an analysis of the capitalist system and the way it's been wired as a, I actually call it, I refer to it as the North American model, because I think if we look at systems, what's happening from the United States to Central America is the elaboration of a regional wide economy, but still relying on the state to create differentiation between nations operating under one economy, and essentially the repressive apparatus of the state. So and then finding how both political parties are complicit in this, and I could go on, give a whole list of these things. So Title 42 was mentioned at the beginning. The Biden administration just announced that recently that they're planning on lifting the Title 42. And for those who don't know or haven't heard, Title 42 is this emergency measure implemented by Trump to basically block any refugees or any undocumented people, anybody from trying to cross the border, and to immediately deport them under conditions of the global pandemic, under the conditions of trying to stop the spread of COVID-19. This actually has its roots in a history of racism, in which exclusion has been justified by saying that immigrants bring diseases, refugees bring diseases, and not just any, but especially the racialization of disease. And it's very interesting because I follow these things closely, and actually the pandemic spread through the southwest of the US before it actually spread into North Mexico. So if anything, the US, people crossing from the US, including many maquiladora managers and workers on this side who are like the technical workers and owners, crossing into the maquiladoras, where they forced maquiladora workers to work under there was a lockdown in Mexico, but they gave an exemption to the maquilas. So the whole border industry continued operating, and my observation was that's what introduced the pandemic into North Mexico, is because it was already intensified here. But when Biden said that he was going to lift, I read the financial press because it's much more honest, in my opinion, about the motives, policy motives. In Financial Times, it quoted him saying, well, we need to lift Title 42 because we need labor. We have labor shortages because, there's something still going on in this country where a lot of people won't work low-wage jobs, and the companies don't feel that they have to pay them higher wages. So it creates this kind of contradiction where there's a lot of people who are just refusing not to work rather than be exploited. And this is the sort of logical outcome of this system, which is, well, then let's bring more immigrants because they have fewer choices, right? But then it's also interesting because it's not just the Republicans that are against it, but it's the Democrats as well. So so to conclude like that, like I think we'll constantly be banging our head if we see that Democrats get elected out of resentment towards the Republicans and what they do in office, only to then continue that. And then the next election to stay away from the polls because they're demoralized, because they feel that they've been let down. I've seen this cycle go on several times now. So we just bang our head and adapt to a lesser and lesser evil, which ultimately contributes to the bigger problem, or we shift our analysis towards the mechanisms that we can change and work through, right? Which I would argue is more at the level of activism, especially abolitionist activism and labor solidarity.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So Mike, one of the things you brought up that I thought was so powerful, right, was these displaced populations. And I was wondering what is the role of various, country governments? So we talked about Haiti, we talked about various governments. We see the presence of these big companies, whether it's Amazon or a variety. They're all familiar to us. But obviously these displaced populations are being affected, and obviously, so the United States is seen as a place to go to have a better quality of life. But what's going on with the governments in these various countries that are not obviously playing any sort of advocacy role for their populations, as far as really ensuring that they have a quality of life in their home, in their homeland that they've known for generations, that unfortunately then they are seeking can be a dangerous path to immigration, when there are jobs and clearly money to be had in their country if there was better advocacy by their own government?
That's a great question, Don. And I would just say that it's the imperialist system also has a political dimension where the US state plays a big role in determining electoral outcomes in places like Central America, especially, and the Caribbean, or influencing in places like Mexico, and propping up regimes that are compliant with the US model that I talked about. So for instance, in Haiti, Juvenal Moise, who was the president that was recently assassinated, creating a lot more, leading to a kind of serious crisis in Haiti, right? Which is the backdrop also for the tragic human rights violations of deporting people who were fleeing a nation in turmoil. Before he was assassinated, the Biden administration, a couple things. One is that there was a mass movement of workers led by the workers in Haiti that were organizing general strikes against the policies associated with what we call neoliberalism or free trade policies. There was mass movements to oppose that and call for significant reforms in the economy and everything from but basically a worker-led movement. When his presidency was up, he just stayed in power. He said, no, I'm not leaving. And the Biden administration said, we support Juvenal Moises. They basically backed him. In I mean, I can go through the list. I'll give one more. In Honduras, one of the major standing nations, the government that just got kicked out a few months ago was a coup government. In 2009, there was a government in Honduras that wanted to renegotiate free trade agreements, that wanted to increase the minimum wage, that wanted to basically restrict foreign capital. It was led by a person named Manuel Zelaya and the Libre Party, well, it was called the Liberal Party at that time. And thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that the US played a direct role in the overthrow of Manuel Zelaya. Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State under Barack Obama, greenlit the military coup that removed him from power, installed an extremely right-wing oligarch, and for the next decade, we've had these far right-wing governments that are so corrupt, and basically steal money and then comply with the U.S., get political backing, repress their people. The most recent, the guy who was part of this line of coup governments, Juan Orlando Hernandez, just got. He went from being a U.S. ally and now he lost power. He's replaced by the wife of the deposed of Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in a coup. Anyways, he lost power, and now the U.S. is trying to extradite him for being part of a cartel. This is the same person that they just supported for the last, several years. So it's a very corrupt system, and I could go on. Guatemala, El Salvador. I could go on, and in Mexico, it's a little bit different because Mexico is a much, has a different political history. It's a much larger economy. The government of AMLO, of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in some ways is a result of the opposition to free trade agreements, going back some decades. In 2006, he actually ran then on a platform against NAFTA and was denied the presidency. He was, it's widespread fraud, and he was denied the presidency, and it created a lot of turmoil for some time in Mexican politics. Well, when he ran again in 2018, he, I read the Mexican press daily, and he ran his campaign very differently this time. He said, I'm not going to touch NAFTA. I'm not, what became the USMCA. I'm not going to touch US-Mexican economic arrangements. Instead, he said, I want to build up our national economy. And what that has meant, for the most part, is mega extractivist policies, partial renationalization of the oil, but not really. So in other words, the norm has been to not address these fundamental economic questions of free trade, colonial, economic neocolonialism, et cetera, because the U.S. leverages a lot of power economically. Mexico sends 80% of its exports to the United States. If the U.S. can afford to cut exports to punish Mexico, but it also is contradictory because many of those exports are from U.S. companies coming back, and that's what Trump tried to do. They said, I'm going to put a 5% tariff. If you don't accept my renegotiation of NAFTA, I'm going to put a 5% tariff on all goods crossing the border. And you could see the Republicans in Congress oh, wait a minute. And then he quickly backed away from that because he didn't know that he would be putting tariffs on his buddies, right? He would be putting tariffs on U.S. investors that back the Republican Party. So it's the political arrangements through and backed with the threat of military intervention. I mean, look at Venezuela. I mean, if you don't go along with the United States, then you run the risk of what Venezuela's been going through, which is a constant threat of external invasion or the supporting of oppositional groups to carry out a coup within their country. So it's a real mess, unfortunately, and there's not a lot of hope to look to in terms of how governments can actually begin to assert more rights on behalf of their people and assert their national interests against these much larger external forces. Instead, we see that happening in the people, and we're probably going to see it continue to increase over the next few years in terms of oppositional movements in these countries.
Yeah, no, thank you. And also, just to add on to that response, this is a historical question in foreign policy, kind of grounding that we have going back to the early 19th century with, the Monroe Doctrine, where Latin America, the West, was under the sphere of influence for up until now under the US. And to think of the birth of, that concept of neoliberalism, that idea that enhances and enables these free trade acts to proliferate, beginning in Chile, right? That's an example of the assassination of Salvador Allende to install a right-wing authoritarian who was going to be beholden to the Washington Consensus and the liberalization of trade and the exploitation of labor. So while it's ideal to think of, no one wants to leave from this place, it's the violence of free trade acts. I think, Justin, that Professor Akers Chacón that you're showing, how that violence is enacted by the states in order to extract their labor wherever they're at. So now, do we have any other questions, comments? I see. There was a question from Guillermo who was asking about, we talked a little bit about the South American effect. Says, does the US have any influence in South America? And what about immigration from South America? Just mentioned the Chile example.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it. Chile was one of the laboratories for forcing in free trade and neoliberal policies under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, military dictator. Yeah, I mean, actually, I write about in the book, like the way in which free trade really begins is through colonialism, through Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Rico is a colony of the US, although we don't, that isn't used, the term colony isn't used formally except by the oppositional movements in Puerto Rico. But that's where much of the sort of laboratory of creating islands of suppressed, workers, low wages, et cetera, was developed. Chile was a laboratory where you could restructure a whole economy and virtually privatize everything. And the US helped, the US supported the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende, as Profe Ponce mentioned. Yeah, I mean, South America is a big place, but I think the distance, means that there's not as much migration because it's much more challenging to cross such a large space. But I also think we would have to look at countries, each has its own sort of trajectory. But yeah, the United States has exerted a lot of influence in places like Colombia. And Colombia is another sort of ground zero of conflict associated with the implementation of free trade. But also, the US worked with Colombia to implement something called Plan Colombia, which was the militarization of that society to suppress an armed insurgency. And that militarization process was then copied again and implemented in Mexico in 2006, 2007, called Plan Merida. And then you have the phenomenon where in places like Brazil, where they are trying to copy, or at least the Bolsonaro regime essentially is modeling itself after had modeled itself after the Trump government. But yeah, they also have their own national contexts and trajectories. So yeah, I guess that would be the short answer. On the question of didn't have to actually send American jobs south of the border. Well, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, because I think capital doesn't, one thing I'm trying to communicate through the book is that capital doesn't operate under national borders, and that free trade agreements have essentially created a kind of borderless world for capital and a highly bordered world for people economically displaced by wealth transfer, through these arrangements. So the U.S. is, really a a path breaker, really, the first to really implement these policies that have been replicated internationally. So Operation Gatekeeper, as I mentioned, built the foundation for the militarization, and starting with the border wall, and then there's other factors we could go into. The border wall was actually first built off of landing strip that was used during the invasion of Iraq or Kuwait in Iraq in 1991, 1992. So the connection to militarism is pretty apparent, where they would build these landing strips through these kind of like puzzle piece metal sheets, and then after that invasion, they then repurposed them to build the border wall. And then actually the first border wall, which was a fencing that was established between a little town to the east of here called Calexico, and across is east of Tecate in the state of Baja California, was actually repurposed fencing from the concentration camps used to house Japanese Americans during World War II. So they built 9 concentration camps to house, again, to intern Japanese Americans. And then when they closed the camps, they repurposed this stuff. So capital doesn't operate anymore under the jurisdiction of national borders, but people are heavily policed by these borders. So in 1994, U.S. Operation Gatekeeper, by today, there's 70, last I counted, 77 border walls that have been constructed in different parts of the world to stop the movement of peoples. From Africa to Asia to Europe, of course. And so this is the kind of like contradiction, right? And so it wasn't so much that U.S. jobs were sent south of the border, it was that capital moved south of the border, and created the kind of reality we have today, this kind of integration of production through supply chains, and then also just capital buying out much of industries through free trade agreements. So Mexico used to have a very industrialized economy. It used to have its own auto industry. It used to have it used to produce all kinds of industrial goods. It used to have its own financial sector. Now you go industry by industry, and it's been privatized and bought out through foreign investors that actually operate and control much of the Mexican. It's called the Bolsa, the Mexican stock market. I'll give one more example of how much these nations have, how much capital has integrated these nations. So Mexico is a large oil producer, and part of the way in which free trade was introduced into Mexico was through debt. Like I mentioned this. So when Mexico ran into high debt in the 1970s and early 1980s, and they ran into a financial distress and banking virtual insolvency. Something I didn't talk about, but I talk about in the books, these international organizations that are largely US and European led, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, these outgrowths of this capital-centric system facilitated the movement of money to bail Mexico out, but with what were called structural adjustment agreements, which basically forced the Mexico to open its economy in exchange for bailout. One of the things that was embedded in one of these letters of intention, as they were referred to, one of these negotiations through this process was that that Mexico and the U.S. created an agency that oversaw the income of Mexico from its oil sector. And this joint U.S.-Mexican agency had the right to basically intervene between the production of profits and the Mexican state to redirect funds to the U.S. Federal Reserve based on how much payments were made, were interest payments had to be paid on the debt acquired through the bailout. So in other words, the U.S. actually had control of Mexico's oil and the rights to the profit before the Mexican state could. And there were times when profits were reported, and by the time they were reported, they were already sitting in the U.S. Federal Reserve and being distributed to U.S. banks before the Mexican people even, were aware that this happened. I mean, it reached that level. And the Mexican financial system is dollarized. Mexico, if you invest in Mexico today, you invest in dollars. Any money that you make in Mexico, the Mexican central bank will convert it into dollars immediately, so that you can repatriate it. They have this thing called Directo a Mexico. It basically wires, again, from the central bank in Mexico to the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. Money just moves like this. And then commerce moves like this, $1 billion a day across the border. Where I live, there's two major crossing points. There's the San Isidro, Tijuana crossing point, and then there's the Otay Mesa crossing point. The Otay Mesa is for commerce, and all it is trucks going. But if you cross through San Isidro in your car or on foot, you have to wait a lot longer than you do if you're crossing it through trucks, right? And so there's the whole border regime is geared towards letting commerce move and restricting the movement of people. And it's the most cross-border in the world. And what percentage of people that cross the border from Mexico to the United States do you think are undocumented or without authorization? Less than 1%. So 80% of all immigration enforcement. Let me say one more thing here. The U.S.-Mexico border is 1,900 miles. The U.S.-Canadian border is like 2,200 miles. 82% of all immigration enforcement is on the U.S.-Mexican side. And it's all geared towards 1% of the population crossing the border. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not really there to stop, but it's the entry point for a restrictive apparatus that extends into every single state in this country, because now ICE operates in all 50 states. And it's essentially exists alongside the undocumented population to police them.
So I'm looking at the clock and we're almost out of time, but in the final minutes, Professor, I know this is overwhelming. You're showing us the scale, you're showing us how we are implicated in all of this. We can no longer say, hey, not our problem, because we created these problems. But to our students, what kind of message would you send out in closing to say, where do we get started with the resistance?
That's a great question. The Chicano professor in me says, look at the Chicano movement and how students made history and struggling within their own institutions for justice. The transborder activist inside me says, probably in our own communities, there's organizations that are struggling to defend our communities from La Migra, from ICE, from all of the extensions of what I call the Migra state, all of these ways in which the state borders us and represses us even within our own communities. So join activist organizations that are doing work to try to overturn these repressive systems and contribute to the liberation of people. And I would also say, try to learn more, because we have to understand the system in order to transform it, I think. And I think we have a lot of examples in our own history of how people have done this. So drawing from our own history, our own peoples, our own cultures, our own struggles, which is another really big part of U.S. history that we don't often lead with when we talk about all the problems. But yeah, I think ultimately there's many entry points for being part of the solution to the problem. Thanks for the question. That's a good one.
Thank you so much. I feel like that'll be our part 2 maybe with Professor Akers Chacón. But for now, I'll just say that we do have our social justice club at DVC. we have Women of Color Association, and of course, you are welcome to join our social justice program. Thank you so much for a really informative and inspiring talk, Professor Ponce.
No, let's just everybody unmute, give a round of applause. Professor Justin Akers Chacón, this is great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be in the space. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm really impressed. I mean, it's a great community, and the program, yeah, amazing. Should be a model that we should study. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.
The presence of spider webs on the window changed Barton's